But let me read this quote, because when we talk about education, the purpose of education, it really is fascinating. So let me just read this. And this is from words from Noah Webster, one of our founders, from 1828, so almost 200 years ago. Quote, "The United States commenced their existence under circumstances wholly novel and unexampled in the history of nations. They commenced with civilization, with learning, with science, with constitutions of free government, and that best gift of God to man, the Christian religion." End quote.
Hi, welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast. This podcast is brought to you by BJU Press Homeschool. Homeschooling is an exciting adventure we take with our children. One of the most challenging parts of this journey is choosing the curriculum you want to use. BJU Press Homeschool is a curriculum you can trust. All the books, resources, and videos have been designed with you and your child in mind. Their curriculum is educationally robust and rich, taking into account that children have different learning styles, strengths, and needs. Mom, you are in charge. BJU Press Homeschool is here to come alongside and support you. Do you need help with the teaching load, or is there a subject you just don't want to teach? Their amazing video courses are available for all grades and almost every subject. BJU Press Homeschool believes that homeschooling can produce a new generation of students who know God, love their neighbors, and stand firm in their faith. For more information, go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast, where our goal is to help you thrive in your homeschool journey. Let me take just a minute to ask you to please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen or watch, including YouTube. And if this podcast has been encouraging to you, please leave us a good review. Each review helps other families like you locate the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well. I am really excited today to welcome back Will Estrada to the podcast. Will has been an attorney since 2006. He worked as a career federal employee in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for 3 years. He served as the first full-time president of parentalrights.org and the Parental Rights Foundation. And in 2023, Will returned to HSLDA, where he worked at the beginning of his career. He's a second-generation homeschooler, and he and his wife, Rachel, homeschool their 2 sons. He is uniquely qualified to discuss our topic today, the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education, and is it a good idea? Thanks, and welcome, Will. Thank you so much for being with me today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Zan, it is always a privilege, so thank you for having me.
So we have a lot to discuss today. What we're going to talk about today is what's going on with the Federal Department of Education. And we know that the Federal Department of Education is only about 40, maybe 44 years old. I think President Carter started it. It was in 1979, but from what I understand, it wasn't fully established until May of 1980. The thing I find interesting in this, Will, is that the homeschooling movement, the renaissance of the homeschooling movement, is about the same age. And I think the homeschooling movement has been highly effective. And so I want to know what you think about getting rid of the Federal Department of Education.
Well, Zan, that is a great question, and I always like to kind of go back to the beginning. When we think about public education in our country, the roots actually predate the founding of the United States of America. So as early as 1647, our Puritan forefathers in Massachusetts, they passed what was called the Old Deluder-Satan Act of 1647. I always encourage people, just Google it, because the opening words are so interesting. It begins, "So that our children can learn to read and read the Bible and not be deluded by our old deluder Satan, we now establish the formation of schools so children can learn to read." And that's really the history of public education. So fast forward a couple hundred of years, there's always been this attempt to have a federal role in education. As early as 1867, Andrew Johnson, who of course was the president, he was Lincoln's running mate, and when Lincoln was assassinated, he became the president. He actually signed into law a bill that created a Department of Education. Now, They had, I think, 4 people working there. Of course, the size and scope of the federal government was minuscule compared to today. But the very next year of 1868, they demoted it to an office of public education. And then we didn't really see a major increase in the role of the federal government until industrialization came. It was Teddy Roosevelt who actually signed into law a bill that gave some federal funds for vocational education. And then you had more and more of this push towards a federal role in education. Of course, after World War II, you had the GIs coming back, the GI Bill, but you didn't have a federal Department of Education. It was just kind of run through other agencies, other departments of making sure of let's give money to our returning soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines
Okay,
who
so that's interesting. Excuse me for interrupting you, but my dad was a World War II vet, and he went to law school on the GI Bill.
I mean,
And
see, it worked.
it did. It worked. I didn't realize, or I never really thought it through to know that the Department of Education on a federal level was not there at that time. And it still worked. Dispersing those funds still worked.
In fact, maybe you could say it worked even better. I mean, pretty much everyone agrees the GI Bill is one of the great successes of making sure that
Absolutely.
we treat our servicemen and women and their children very well. But then, fast forward, we had Lyndon B. Johnson, and he gave his great society speeches. He said, we're just going to increase the role of the federal government in many areas. And one of the big reasons was the disparities between low income and high income families, minority families. And that really was the genesis of Carter signing into law in 1979, the law that established the Federal Department of Education, and then it being created as its own cabinet level department in 1980. Interestingly enough, Ronald Reagan, who did many great things, campaigned on abolishing the Federal Department of Education, and he did a lot of things, but he was unable to abolish the U.S. Department of Education. Fun story, and then I'll turn it back to you, Zan. I've done many things in my career. I've been at HSLDA for many years, but for several years, I served as a career federal employee in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. And prior to Department of Education becoming its own standalone cabinet level department, it was a division of HHS. Back then, it was called HUE, the Health, Education, and Welfare Department. So I would still come across paperwork using HUE, Health, Education, and Welfare from when the education decisions were part of HHS. Fun story
Oh,
there.
oh, that is so interesting. Boy, I think there's some people who worry that kids may suffer somehow if this federal Department of Education is abolished or dismantled, whichever word you want to use. Um, but I think the thing we need to look at is how much it's helped in terms of test scores or leveling the playing field between those who are disadvantaged economically and those who are not. And when I look at it, I mean, it seems like we're still sandwiched in the middle in terms of not third world countries, but in terms of countries around the nation who have invested in education. We're not on the top. And our
We're nowhere
test
close to the top. It's heartbreaking.
and I don't think our test scores have improved that much. As a matter of fact, we have a huge number of functionally illiterate kids in our system, those who can't even fill out their own job application when they apply for jobs.
Zan, there's been a lot of talk, as you said, about President Trump abolishing the Department of Education, Congress getting rid of it, sending these decisions back, maybe back to HHS and have HUE back again, Health, Education, and Welfare, or just sending the decisions to the states. If public education were doing a good job, if kids in public schools were progressing academically, this would be a much harder conversation to have. But since particularly 1980 and the massive increase in both the federal role in education, federal involvement in education and federal spending in education, we have actually seen a significant and precipitous decline in the academic scores. The gap between rich and poor families and their kids' academic success is increasing. The best way to see this, and really the most heartbreaking way to see this, is with what's called the NAEP scores. These are the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's essentially the same test that they've been doing since the 70s. It only is a test that tests public and private school students, doesn't apply to homeschoolers. And just a couple weeks ago, the most recent NAEP scores came out. These are the scores of usually fourth and eighth graders. And tragically, the NAEP scores did not paint a good picture of academic success. There have been massive losses in academic success of public school students, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic. But in a nutshell, a third of public school eighth graders, like you said, are functionally illiterate. Now, the interesting thing is that the NAEP scores is broken out between private and public school students. Private school students are doing well academically, but kids in our public schools, where the funding is coming from the U.S. Department of Education, a third are functionally illiterate. It's heartbreaking.
That really is heartbreaking. And it doesn't make sense to us as taxpayers, I think, unless we stop and think about our roots as a country. And education is not mentioned in the US Constitution. It's never been seen in the purview or as a responsibility of the US government. It's always been what's closest to the child. And so, as homeschoolers, we know, well, as a society, we know the parents are closest to the children. And that's what I think makes home education so effective. We see their needs, we understand their learning styles, we can become students of our children. The further away from that you go, the more of that intimate knowledge you lose. So, as when we can stay in our local communities, and for heaven's sakes, at least in our state, there's that sense of being in a culture that understands our kids. And but the further we get, and certainly when we move to the US government level, the federal government level, we lose that connection.
That really is the truth. And Zane, I was very heartened. Some of our listeners might have recently seen the confirmation hearings for Linda McMahon. Trump has nominated her to be the Secretary of Education, maybe the last Secretary of Education.
Yeah,
We'll see. But I was very heartened in her confirmation hearings. She said exactly what you just said. She said the most important people when it comes to the education of children are those closest. And she said the parents, and then she said the teachers. And that's the beauty of homeschooling. And I think why, even though we're tragically seeing the decline of NAEP scores for public school students, homeschoolers do incredibly well academically. The studies show that because it's closest, the parents know
that's
their
right.
children the best. They love their children the most. They are able to have that education the closest to the kids.
Absolutely. And, I think it's interesting because some people are really fretting and so angry over this move to dismantle the US Department of Education. But I look at all the ways that society has also come after homeschoolers. I mean, we know my story. I'm just one of many. I was threatened with jail when I started homeschooling. And then we get to the point where Elizabeth Bartholet, a Harvard law professor, called for a presumptive ban on homeschooling not too long ago, 2020, if I'm
2020. Yeah.
yes, her timing was atrocious, um, which we can all be thankful for. But, so we have really come under attack as a community as well. I believe that God has stood for us, but I also believe not but, and I also believe that it's because home education works so well.
That really is the truth. And we've had a lot of questions, Zane, about what would be the impact if the U.S. Department of Education were either abolished or downsized. And I mean, it really wouldn't affect homeschoolers. So I always, it might be interesting to kind of just talk about the potential effect. As you said, the Constitution leaves educational decisions to the states or to the people, the Ninth and 10th Amendments. And so historically in our country, there's been a very limited role of the federal government in education. That's why when you look at homeschooling, it's not a federal law. It's a 50-state patchwork of laws. Some states have great laws. Some states like Pennsylvania and New York have not so great laws. Homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. Parental rights are protected under the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court has said it's a fundamental right, which is the highest level of right. You and I, Zan, would say that's a God-given right of where these rights come from. But if the U.S. Department of Education were to be shut down, it would really not affect homeschoolers one bit. Private schoolers wouldn't have much of an impact as well. There's always a question of what about civil rights laws? Department of Ed doesn't really protect those anyway. Department of Justice is the one that enforces federal
Interesting.
civil rights laws through lawsuits, through legal action. And so the only impact that would be felt would be in public education. And most of that impact would actually be beneficial to public schools. And I'll give you two examples, Zan. I can give you three. The first one is, as we've seen the increase of the federal Department of Education, there's not been a corresponding increase in test scores. So
Right.
we have only really to go anywhere but up. The second one, though, and probably the most major one, would be states would be free to make decisions. And some of these are hot button issues. Think of Title IX, for example. This is the landmark. I think it's 52 years old now. This was the federal law that Congress passed to make sure that women and girls would be treated fairly, particularly in sports, but there's a lot of other impacts. The Democrat administrations have interpreted Title IX in one way. They've had the gender identity issue. The Republican administrations have interpreted it differently, and I think more closely to what the intent of Congress was. But in any event, if you don't have the Department of Education kind of ping-ponging based on if Republicans or Democrats are in charge, then states could have that. Some states like California and New York might go in a very different way, but other states like Florida or Texas might go in a different way, and parents could vote with their feet. Our founders wanted the states to be the laboratories of democracy so that we have one country, but so that some of these decisions people decide. And if you don't
That's
like how
right.
it's going, you move to a different state. And then the final impact, and this would be very beneficial, I think, on public schools, would be essentially, Department of Education is a middleman. Congress appropriates the money, and then it goes to Department of Ed to kind of the bureaucrats. There's about 6,000 federal employees of the U.S. Department of Education. That doesn't count contractors.
In a
That doesn't
huge building.
in a huge, the Lyndon B. Johnson building that's right in downtown D.C.
That's right.
And they don't do a single bit of education of kids. There's about $50 to $60 billion a year that goes just to Department of Ed. Of course, there's more money with federal student aid, but just kind of the K through 12 side, that could just go straight to the states. Cut out the middleman, have Congress appropriate the funds. Those funds just go straight to the state departments of education to hire teachers to actually educate children. So again, no impact on homeschools, very little impact on private schools. And the impact you would have on the public schools could actually be really beneficial to the kids who are still in public schools.
So let me ask you this. What about I think it's SFA the Student Finance Act or administration
Or
or
yeah, there's the Higher Education Act, the HEA, Higher Education Act of 1998. There were major amendments done. We actually got some language in to make sure homeschoolers were eligible for funds. But yeah, it all goes through federal agencies for the higher education purposes.
okay. So what about, when my child wants a Pell Grant or a Stafford loan, would those things still be available?
Yeah, so that's think of the FAFSA form, which if you were recently filling out the FAFSA form for a child, Department of Education just horribly bungled that. It
I
caused
remember that.
significant problems. Governor Youngkin recently appointed me to the board of visitors of one of our state universities, Christopher Newport University here in Virginia, and it caused massive issues of how much money are we going to get just because it was so badly bungled. So that is something that would still continue even if Department of Education were to be shut down. It would be an open question. Would it be a very small Department of Education that basically was just focused on higher ed? Or would it revert back to HHS, Health and Human Services, or would it be under, some other bureau? There's another thing that Department of Education does, and this is the National Center for Education Statistics. That could be put under the Census Bureau, for example. They do very interesting reports on the growth of homeschooling. Actually, just last year in September, they issued the first official report on the number of homeschoolers post-COVID, and it was anywhere from 4 to 5% of the school-age population. So massive increase of the number of homeschoolers since COVID. But those are kind of two examples of where it could either be under a very small Department of Ed or just put it under different agencies.
Okay. So let's talk about this one more time. We homeschoolers will not be hurt and may be helped by
Right.
not having a US Department of Education.
Yeah, I don't think there'd really be any impact on homeschoolers, neither positive nor negative, because
Okay.
there's no federal involvement when it comes to homeschooling.
Okay, unless it looks like we don't care about the rest of the school age population, we really feel like it's better for kids not to have the US Department of Education, but to have people at a more local level, at their state level or local level, making educational decisions.
It leaves the decisions to the states, as you said, the people closer, and then kind of frees up money that can go to higher teachers, smaller classroom sizes, however states wanted to use it.
I'm reminded of several times where I feel like the US Department of Education has bullied states. If you don't use this money the way we're telling you to, you can't have it.
It's unconstitutional for the federal government to do that, I believe, but the way they get around that is through the power of the purse. And so if we as you're 100% correct, that happens all the time. Blue states are mad when Republicans are in control. Red states are mad when the Democrats are in control in Washington, D.C. Look, let's just take out the middleman. There's really no need for this. Don't let the federal government bully the states. We have 50 states. Our founders wanted the states to be laboratories of democracy. So it's going to let the states kind of see what works, and people can decide and kind of see for themselves what works and what doesn't.
Well, listen, one thing I would love for you to read for me. We have been talking about the 1828 dictionary by Noah Webster. I'd love for you to read one of his great quotes. This is one of my favorite books. I just have to tell you.
Zan, I love that you mentioned Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. We had one growing up as homeschoolers. I think pretty much every homeschool family has at some point. And when you think of this, going back to 1647, Old Deluder Satan Act, it's important to remember that education is not neutral. And when you think of, even just some of the battles over what we're seeing in public school curriculum and textbooks, I think we're kind of reaping the whirlwind of basically 60 years of trying to think that education is neutral when it can't be. And, Noah Webster he wrote this dictionary. It came out in 1828. Interestingly enough, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. So mark your calendars for next year, July 4th, 2026. I don't think I'll be alive for the 300th anniversary of the United States of America. But, we're also coming up on the 200th anniversary of Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. But let me read this quote, because when we talk about education, the purpose of education, it really is fascinating. So let me just read this. And this is from words from Noah Webster, one of our founders, from 1828, so almost 200 years ago. Quote, "The United States commenced their existence under circumstances wholly novel and unexampled in the history of nations. They commenced with civilization, with learning, with science, with constitutions of free government, and with that best gift of God to man, the Christian religion." End quote.
Boy, that's powerful. One of the things you and I have talked about is what a learned man Noah Webster is. He was a founding father, had his law degree, couldn't make a living after the Revolutionary War because everybody was broke. He began writing curriculum. And he wrote curriculum based on, he was fluent in 28 languages, but he was also very aware that he wanted children in the United States to grow up with an appreciation of the Bible, and he wanted them to grow up with an appreciation of living in a constitutional republic. And he wrote curriculum along those lines in all subjects. And until he died in 1843, he had sold 100 million copies of those textbooks to students north, south, east, and west. And some historians believe this is why we were able to maintain our integrity as Christians in this country for as long as we did. And then what happens in 1843, the mid 1840s. You can take it away with that.
Oh, there was
With
lots of
horseman,
things
yeah.
going on in our country. You had the rise of slavery, but you also had the secularization of education. So you had a man like Noah Webster writes his dictionary. He talks about the importance of Christian religion. But then you had Horace Mann, and Horace Mann is called by many the father of modern American public education. And if he's the father, then no wonder we have problems when it comes to public education. He was a secularist. he really laid the seeds of saying education is not just neutral, but secular. And kind of contrary to Noah Webster, who said that, it comes from God and the Christian religion is the most important thing. So even, sometimes people, I think, pine for the olden days. And there were a lot of challenges in our country. Of course, you had slavery, you had racism, but you also had this massive rejection of morality and of religion and of Christianity. And sometimes it takes a long time to see the fruits of where that leads in civilization. But the fruits of Horace Mann have been incredibly negative. As another thing, you had Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, you had Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. And so you almost had that trifecta of Horace Mann, Karl Marx, and Charles Darwin of something that laid the seeds of the battles we're still having when it comes to education. What is the purpose of education? And even just kind of broader issues of what is my purpose as a person in the world?
One of the other quotes that I like so much from Noah Webster, I hate to keep going back to this, but I think it's foundational for us because he was a founding father and it's foundational in our faith. So forgive me while I look this way to read it off my other computer screen. He said in his dictionary, to give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable, and an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. So we want to be free in terms of our educational choices so we can reinforce our children's faith. So we can all the things we want to teach them revolve around that. I mean, we are and I think we can continue because homeschooling works so well educationally. As you said, our test scores are off the charts when it comes to when it's compared to other methods of education.
I love that quote you had there, though, Zane, and it reminded me of another quote. I recently wrote a law review titled "Homeschooling in the United States: A Seismic Victory for Parental Rights." It was published last summer, so August of 2024, by Liberty University School of Law, and I went through basically the entire history of parental rights and how they set the framework for homeschooling, the modern homeschool movement in the United States. I went through, parental rights in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three great Abrahamic world religions. But as I was writing about, I went to the Greek philosophers, English common law philosophers, Blackstone, all those people. But as I was writing about Christianity, I quoted from Matthew Henry. Of course, he wrote the 6 volume commentary of the Bible. And on Ephesians 6, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. In 1706, when he wrote this commentary, Matthew Henry writes, and I quote, "Parents, give your children a Christian education," end quote. Just that importance of what you said of math, art, science, yes, but also preparing our children for eternity.
That's right. The why, the great why of
Yes.
what we do. You're exactly right. Well, Will, how many children do you have?
We've got 2. So Dominic is 12, Merrick is 7. We live in Western Loudoun County, Virginia. And my wife's a homeschool graduate. I'm a homeschool graduate. And so it's just the greatest privilege of our life being able to homeschool our 2 boys.
It is be having that. Elizabeth Elliot said her greatest privilege in life was to be someone's mother. And, just have to say a hearty amen to that. But the opportunity to be with my kids in their growing up years and to see them learn and grow and their faith and their abilities, while I stood back and watched a lot of times, you just love your kids. I love what Jim Mason says there at HSLDA that homeschooling is really a love your kids movement. And I think in some of the political dialogue and discourse we find ourselves involved in sometimes, people lose that. But at the foundation of it all is the truth.
Is yes. Yes.
So so I wanna thank you, Will, for being here today, and I wanna thank HSLDA too. You guys have stood by my side for over 40 years, and it's a pleasure to recommend you. If you're not a member of HSLDA, I would say join. If you are a member of a state that has a group membership, it's only $115 a year. And if you are in a state that is so free and you think, I don't need this, think about your brothers and sisters in Illinois and some other states right now. If Virginia just had a huge fight, we need to stand together, or as Benjamin Franklin said, we hang together or we hang separately. And so think of this as a gift to the movement so that we continue to walk in freedom.
Thank you, Zan. It's always a privilege being with you, and you're one of my heroes when it comes to homeschool freedom and really just everything else.
Well, thank you. Well, how can people find you if they want to?
I'm easy to find. You can go to our webpage, hslda.org. HSLDA is also on all the social media places, X, Facebook, Instagram. We're not on TikTok, but we're on the other ones.
Okay, great. And as always, you can find me at zantyler.com and on social media. Thanks so much for spending your time with us today. Will, it was a pleasure. We pray that God will continue to shed his grace on us as a nation and that he will bless you and your family. So until
Amen.
next time, bye.